Let me tell you about my cabin. It's not fancy or big, but it means everything to me. Nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by tall pine trees and the sound of rustling leaves, it's a place I call my own. I saved for years to buy it, skipping dinners out, canceling vacations, and working extra shifts just to make it happen. 5 years ago, I finally signed the papers, and from that day on, this little wooden retreat became more than just a building. It was my escape, a place where I could leave behind the stress of city life, write poetry no one would ever read, and sip coffee while watching deer wander through the forest. The cabin is simple, a small living room with creaky wooden floors, a cozy kitchen with an old stove, and 2 tiny bedrooms upstairs. There's no high-speed internet, no smart appliances, and definitely no neighbors within shouting distance. That's exactly how I like it. Every time I drive up the dirt road leading to the cabin, I feel a weight lift off my shoulders. This is my sanctuary, my slice of peace in a chaotic world. So when I opened my mailbox one crisp autumn morning and found a letter from some group calling themselves the Homeowners Association, HOA, I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe they were inviting me to a community event or asking if I wanted to join their club. But as I unfolded the paper and started reading, my stomach dropped. They weren't welcoming me. They were demanding something ridiculous. According to the letter, my property technically fell under their jurisdiction because it shared a boundary line with their subdivision. I had never heard of this HOA before, and honestly, I didn't care. I bought this land to get away from people telling me what to do. But apparently, they had rules, and lots of them. The most shocking part, they insisted that I turn my cabin into a community guest house for their use. Can you believe that? My private refuge, the one place I go to escape, was now being asked to serve as a weekend getaway spot for strangers. The letter went on to explain how this arrangement would supposedly benefit everyone. Your charming cabin will provide a unique experience for our valued members, it said. Charming. Sure, if you're into mismatched furniture and spiderwebs in the corners. Unique experience. More like a headache for me. And valued members. Who were these people anyway? I'd barely met any of my so-called neighbors since moving here. Most of them lived miles away behind gates and manicured lawns, worlds apart from my humble hideaway. As I read further, my frustration grew. Not only did they expect me to open my home to them, but they also hinted that refusing would come with consequences. Fines, legal action, maybe even forced compliance. It was all vaguely worded, but the message was clear. Play along, or else. I crumpled the letter in my fist and stared out the window. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden patterns on the ground. Birds chirped happily, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. How dare they try to take this away from me? This cabin wasn't just 4 walls and a roof. It was my dream, my hard-earned reward. What gave them the right to barge in and demand control over it? For a moment, I considered ignoring the letter entirely. Maybe they'd forget about me if I stayed quiet long enough. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't work. People like this didn't give up easily. If anything, silence might make them push harder. So instead, I tossed the crumpled letter into the fireplace and watched it burn. The flames devoured the paper quickly, leaving nothing but ashes. It felt good, for about 5 seconds. Then reality hit me again. Burning a letter wouldn't stop them. This was only the beginning, and I needed to figure out what to do next. 2 days after I burned that letter, there was a knock on my door. At first, I thought it might be a delivery person, or maybe someone lost in the woods. But when I opened the door, my heart sank. Standing on my porch were 3 people dressed like they'd just stepped out of a catalog for suburban perfection. Matching polo shirts with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest, keikis pressed so sharply you could cut paper with them, and smiles so polished they looked fake. "Good morning," said the man in front, extending his hand. His name was Mr. Hargrove, according to the shiny badge clipped to his shirt. He introduced himself as the president of the HOA. Flanking him were 2 women who looked equally put together, but far less friendly. One carried a clipboard, her pen poised like she was ready to jot down every word I said, or maybe every mistake I made. The other held what appeared to be a folder stuffed with papers. "We're here to welcome you officially to our lovely community," Mr. Hargrove announced, his grin stretching wider than seemed humanly possible. "I'm not part of your community," I replied flatly, crossing my arms over my chest. "And I don't plan to be." Mr. Hargrove chuckled, though his eyes stayed sharp, calculating. "Oh, but you are, Ms. Carter. Whether you realize it or not, your property falls under our jurisdiction. Now we'd love to discuss how you can make your charming little cabin available to our members." He gestured toward the woman with the clipboard, who promptly handed me a stack of documents thicker than a phone book. I flipped through the pages, scanning titles like community guidelines, guest house policies, and membership obligations. Each section spelled out rules stricter than anything I'd ever seen. No loud music after 8 p.m., no pets larger than 10 pounds, no alterations to the exterior without written approval, and worst of all, mandatory availability for HOA events. It felt like they wanted to turn my cabin into a hotel room they could rent out whenever they pleased. "This is ridiculous," I muttered, shaking my head. I didn't agree to any of this. Mrs. Langley, the woman with the clipboard, spoke up then, her tone icy. "Actually, Ms. Carter, you did. When you purchased this property, you agreed to abide by certain regulations tied to the shared boundary line. Those regulations include joining the HOA and contributing to its initiatives." My jaw tightened. I remembered signing paperwork when I bought the cabin, but no one had mentioned an HOA. Had I missed something, or had they buried the details in fine print, hoping buyers wouldn't notice? Mr. Hargrove leaned in slightly, his voice softening as if he were trying to reason with me. "Think of it as an opportunity, Miss Carter. Your cabin has potential. It's rustic, unique, exactly what our members look for in a getaway. And don't worry, we'll handle everything. Cleaning, maintenance, reservations. All you have to do is say yes. Say yes to giving up control of my home, to letting strangers traipse through my space, leaving crumbs on the counters and muddy footprints on the floors." The very idea made my skin crawl. "I'll need time to think about it," I lied, stepping back and closing the door before they could argue further. Through the window, I watched them exchange glances before walking away. Their polished shoes crunched against the gravel driveway, their confident strides suggesting they weren't used to hearing the word no. Once they were gone, I sank onto the couch, clutching the stack of papers like they were evidence in a trial. My mind raced. What if I refused? Would they really take legal action? Could they force me to comply? Every scenario I imagined ended with me losing something. My peace, my privacy, my freedom. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on normal life, but it was impossible. Every sound outside, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, made me jump, convinced it was the HOA coming back to pressure me again. I started second-guessing everything. Was it okay to leave lights on at night? Should I lock both doors even during the day? Did I accidentally violate some obscure rule just by existing here? Then came the flowers. One morning, I opened the door to find a bouquet of daisies sitting neatly on the porch. Attached was a small card written in elegant handwriting. "Looking forward to seeing you soon." No signature, no explanation. Just those cheerful words that somehow felt sinister. The next day, another gift arrived. A basket of homemade cookies wrapped in cellophane. Then a bottle of wine. Each item was accompanied by a note, each note slightly more pointed than the last. By the fourth delivery, a decorative doormat that read, "Welcome home." I realized this wasn't kindness. It was intimidation. Every knock on the door, every unexpected visitor. The gifts kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. At first, I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was just some weird attempt at being neighborly. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't about friendship or goodwill. It was a power play. Every daisy, every cookie, Every note felt like another step in their game, designed to wear me down. And it was working. The constant reminders that they were watching, waiting, expecting me to cave, it all gnawed at my nerves. I couldn't sleep properly anymore. Every creak of the cabin's old floorboards made me sit up in bed, heart pounding. Every car driving past on the dirt road outside had me peeking through the curtains, half expecting to see Mr. Hargrove or one of his cronies glaring back at me. I even started double-checking the locks on the doors before going to bed, something I'd never done before. It was exhausting, feeling like I was under siege in my own home. But then I realized something. I couldn't let them win. This cabin wasn't just wood and nails. It represented everything I'd worked for. Freedom, independence, a place where I could truly be myself. If I gave in now, what would be left of me? So instead of letting fear take over, I decided to fight back. And the first step was understanding exactly what I was up against. For the next week, I buried myself in research. I scoured the internet for information about HOAs, reading articles, forums, and legal advice columns. I learned that while HOAs did have certain powers, those powers weren't unlimited. There were laws protecting property owners from unreasonable demands, and there were ways to challenge unfair rules. Armed with this knowledge, I began digging deeper into my own situation. I pulled out the stack of papers the HOA had given me and read through them carefully, line by line. Sure enough, I found loopholes and ambiguities. For example, the shared boundary clause they kept citing didn't explicitly state that I had to join the HOA. It only mentioned compliance with specific regulations related to land use. Turning my cabin into a guest house wasn't listed anywhere as a requirement. In fact, most of the rules focused on things like noise levels and landscaping, not commandeering private homes for public use. Feeling a flicker of hope, I drafted a formal response denying their demands. I cited specific sections of the documents they provided, pointing out inconsistencies and questioning the legality of their requests. Then I sent copies to the HOA board, the local zoning office, and a lawyer friend who promised to review the case pro bono. For the first time since receiving that letter, I felt like I had a plan, a way to stand my ground without backing down. Still, preparation doesn't stop fear from creeping in. Even as I worked on my defense, I couldn't shake the feeling that the HOA wasn't going to let this go quietly. They'd already shown how far they were willing to go, leaving gifts, showing up uninvited, making veiled threats. What would they do next? Would they escalate? Sue me? Fine me? Try to force me out? One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by notes and printouts, Max called me. My son lived in the city, juggling college classes and part-time jobs, but he always checked in when he sensed I was stressed. "Mom, you okay?" he asked after hearing the tension in my voice. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile even though he couldn't see me. "Just dealing with some stuff." He hesitated, then said softly, "You know, you don't have to handle everything alone. You can tell me, you know." His words hit me harder than I expected. Tears welled up in my eyes, and for a moment, I considered spilling everything. The letters, the visits, the gifts, the fear. But I stopped myself. Max had enough on his plate already. He didn't need to worry about his mom fighting off an HOA bent on taking over her life. Instead, I took a deep breath and said, "Thanks, kiddo. I'll be okay. Just promise me you won't forget how important this place is to me, all right?" "I won't," he replied firmly. "It's your happy place. Always has been." After we hung up, I stared at the wall for a long time, thinking about what he'd said. This cabin was my happy place. It was where I went to recharge, to dream, to feel alive. If I lost it, or worse, if I let them turn it into something it wasn't, I'd lose a piece of myself too. That night, I made a promise to myself. No matter what happened, I wouldn't give up. Not without a fight. The doormat was the final straw. When I found it lying on my porch one morning, bright yellow with the words "Welcome Home" stitched into it in bold letters. I snapped. It wasn't just the gift itself that bothered me. It was the audacity behind it. They were marking their territory, sending a clear message. This isn't your home anymore. It's ours. I grabbed the doormat and marched down to the HOA office, determined to confront them once and for all. The drive felt endless, each mile building my anger until I could barely see straight. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of their sleek, glass-fronted building, my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Inside, the air smelled like expensive cologne and freshly brewed coffee. Everything about the place screamed wealth and control, from the polished marble floors to the oversized paintings hanging on the walls. At the front desk, a receptionist greeted me with a practiced smile. "Can I help you?" she asked sweetly, as if she didn't already know why I was there. "I need to speak to Mr. Hargrove," I said, slamming the doormat onto the counter. "Right now." Her smile faltered for a split second, but she recovered quickly. "Let me check if he's available." She picked up the phone, whispered something, and hung up. "He'll be right out." A few minutes later, Mr. Hargrove appeared, flanked by Mrs. Langley and another board member whose name I couldn't remember. His usual confident demeanor wavered slightly when he saw the look on my face. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice smooth as silk. "What brings you here today?" "What brings me here?" I repeated, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. "You've been leaving gifts on my porch. Flowers, cookies, wine. And now this." I pointed at the doormat like it was evidence in a courtroom. "Do you think this is funny? Do you think it's charming? Because let me tell you, it's not. It's creepy, and it's harassment." Mrs. Langley stepped forward, clutching her clipboard like a shield. "Miss Carter, these are gestures of goodwill. We're simply trying to build rapport." "Rapport?" I cut her off, incredulous. "You call trespassing on my property rapport? You don't even have permission to come near my cabin, let alone leave things on my porch." Mr. Hargrove raised a hand, silencing her. He gave me a patronizing smile, the kind that made my blood boil. "I understand your concerns, Miss Carter, but surely we can find common ground. Your cabin has potential. It could be such an asset to our community. Why resist something that benefits everyone?" "Benefits everyone?" I shot back, my voice shaking with frustration. "How does turning my private home into a guest house benefit me? How does giving strangers access to my space improve my life? Or is this really just about power? About controlling every inch of land within your reach?" For the first time since I'd met him, Mr. Hargrove's mask slipped, his jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Careful, Miss Carter," he said, his tone icy. "You won't win this fight alone." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Was he threatening me? Warning me? Either way, they sent a chill down my spine. But instead of backing down, I stood taller, refusing to let him intimidate me. "We'll see about that," I replied, my voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. I left the office feeling both empowered and rattled. On one hand, I'd stood my ground, calling them out for what they were doing. On the other, their reaction confirmed everything I'd suspected. They weren't going to back off anytime soon. If anything, I'd probably made them angrier. That night, as I sat on the porch staring at the darkened woods, I realized something important. I couldn't face this battle alone. Sure, I had done my research and drafted responses, but fighting an organization like the HOA required more than paperwork and legal arguments. It required allies, people who understood what I was going through and were willing to stand with me. The next day, I started reaching out. First, I visited the few neighbors I knew nearby, explaining the situation and asking if they'd experienced similar pressure from the HOA. Some nodded sympathetically, but admitted they were too scared to resist. Others shrugged it off, saying they didn't want trouble. Disheartened but not defeated, I expanded my search online, joining forums, and Facebook groups dedicated to fighting HOAs. To my surprise, dozens of people reached out, sharing their own horror stories and offering advice. One woman named Claire lived just outside the subdivision and had fought the same HOA years ago. She became my lifeline, guiding me through strategies and connecting me with others who might support my cause. Slowly but surely, I began piecing together a network of allies, people who believed in standing up for what was right, no matter how intimidating the opposition seemed. By the end of the week, I had a small group of supporters ready to help me take a stand. Together, we planned our next move, knowing full well that the HOA wouldn't give up without a fight. But for the first time in weeks, I felt less alone and more determined than ever to protect my cabin, my sanctuary, and my freedom. With a growing group of supporters behind me, I finally felt like I had a fighting chance. But standing up to the HOA wasn't just about having people on my side. It was about showing them that we weren't afraid. That no matter how much they tried to intimidate or manipulate us, we wouldn't back down. We needed a plan, something bold enough to make them take notice, but smart enough to keep us protected. Claire suggested organizing a protest. "You can't let them think they're untouchable," she said during one of our late-night phone calls. "If you want to send a message, you need to do it publicly. Get the community involved. Bring in reporters. Make them see that this isn't just your fight anymore." At first, the idea terrified me. A protest in front of the HOA office. What if things got out of hand? What if they retaliated even harder? But as I thought about it more, I realized Claire was right. The HOA thrived on secrecy and control. They operated in the shadows, using fear and bureaucracy to silence anyone who dared challenge them. If we dragged their actions into the light, maybe we could expose the truth and force them to back off. The next morning, I called a meeting with my newfound allies. We gathered at Claire's house, a cozy little bungalow filled with mismatched furniture and the smell of fresh coffee. Around the table sat a mix of neighbors, friends of friends, and even a couple who lived miles away but had heard about our struggle online. Everyone brought something to the table: ideas, resources, determination. "We need signs," someone said. "Something eye-catching. Something that tells people exactly what's going on." "Property rights matter," another chimed in. "That's catchy." "And no to coercion," added a third. "It's simple but powerful." As the ideas flowed, I felt a spark of hope ignite inside me. These people weren't just offering support, they were taking ownership of the cause, turning it into something bigger than any of us individually. By the end of the meeting, we had a solid plan. We'd hold a peaceful demonstration outside the HOA office the following Saturday, complete with signs, flyers, and hopefully some media coverage. Over the next few days, we worked tirelessly to spread the word. Flyers were printed and posted around town. Social media posts went viral within local groups, and a few brave souls even knocked on doors in the subdivision, inviting residents to join us. Not everyone was eager to participate. Many were still too scared of the HOA's wrath, but enough people agreed to show up that I started feeling cautiously optimistic. On the day of the protest, the weather mirrored my mood: gray skies, a biting wind, and an occasional drizzle that kept everyone on edge. As I drove toward the HOA office, my stomach churned with nerves. What if no one showed up? What if the HOA found a way to shut us down before we even started? But when I arrived, my fears melted away. Dozens of people stood gathered in the parking lot, holding handmade signs and chatting animatedly. Some faces I recognized from our meetings. Others were strangers who had decided to join the cause. Reporters from local news outlets set up cameras and microphones, ready to capture the moment. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a sense of unity, a shared purpose that made me believe we could actually win. I stepped onto a small platform someone had set up and grabbed a megaphone. My hands trembled, but my voice rang out clear and strong. "They think they own us," I declared, pointing at the sleek building behind me. "But they don't. Our homes are ours, not theirs to control. The crowd erupted into cheers, chanting slogans like "Shame, shame," and "Stand up, fight back." Inside the building, blinds twitched as faces peered out, watching the chaos unfold. After months of feeling powerless, I finally saw a crack in their armor. Mr. Hargrove eventually emerged, looking pale and disheveled. He tried to speak, but his words were drowned out by the noise. For once, he looked small, like a man who had been caught in the act and had nowhere to hide. That night, as I lay in bed replaying the events in my mind, I allowed myself a moment of quiet triumph. We hadn't won yet, but for the first time, the HOA looked vulnerable, and that gave me hope. The protest was a turning point, but it wasn't the end of the battle. That night, as I scrolled through photos and videos people had shared online, I couldn't help but feel proud of what we accomplished. The images showed dozens of us standing together, holding signs and chanting slogans, while reporters captured every moment. For the first time, the HOA's actions were exposed, not just to our small community, but to the wider public. It felt like a victory, even if it was only symbolic. But pride quickly gave way to caution. I knew the HOA wouldn't take this lying down. People like Mr. Hargrove didn't lose gracefully. They doubled down, found new ways to intimidate, and exploited every loophole they could. So when an email from the HOA landed in my inbox later that evening, I opened it with a mix of dread and defiance. The tone was different this time. Less demanding, more conciliatory. "Dear Ms. Carter," it began, "we regret any misunderstanding regarding your property and wish to assure you that we value your privacy." Misunderstanding. Was that what they were calling their campaign of gifts and threats now? They went on to say they'd reconsider their stance on turning my cabin into a guest house and hoped we could move forward amicably. It sounded almost reasonable, but I wasn't fooled. This wasn't an olive branch, it was damage control. After the protest, they must have realized they'd overplayed their hand. Public scrutiny was the last thing they wanted. Still, I forwarded the email to Claire and the rest of the group for advice. "They're backing off because they're scared." Claire replied immediately, "But don't trust them. They'll try again when the attention dies down." She was right. The protest had shaken them, but it hadn't defeated them. If anything, it had forced them to retreat temporarily, regroup, and plan their next move. And I knew better than to think they'd let me, or anyone else, off the hook so easily. Over the following weeks, life returned to a tense kind of normalcy. No more flowers or cookies appeared on my porch. No more unannounced visits from Mr. Hargrove or his board members. But the silence felt heavier somehow, like the calm before another storm. Every knock on the door made me flinch. Every car driving past the cabin felt suspicious. I started checking the mailbox obsessively, half expecting another letter filled with thinly veiled threats. Despite the lingering unease, I tried to focus on the positives. The protest had done more than expose the HOA. It had brought people together. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now exchanged smiles and waves. Strangers became allies, united by a shared cause. Even Max noticed the change during one of his weekend visits. "You seem lighter," he said, tilting his head thoughtfully, "like you're not carrying the world on your shoulders anymore." I smiled at him, realizing how much truth there was in his words. Fighting back had given me strength, not just to stand up to the HOA, but to reclaim my sense of self-worth. This cabin wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of everything I valued. Independence, freedom, resilience. Letting someone take that away would mean losing a part of myself. Still, I stayed vigilant. Claire kept reminding me that the HOA might retaliate quietly, targeting others instead of me directly. Sure enough, rumors began circulating about fines being handed out to residents who hadn't followed minor rules. Overgrown hedges, mismatched curtains, cars parked slightly askew. It was petty, vindictive behavior designed to remind everyone who held the power. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Claire called me. "They've been quiet too long," she said. "We need to stay ready, just in case." "I know," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "But for now, let's enjoy the peace while it lasts." And for the first time in months, I meant it. Whatever came next, I knew I wasn't alone. Together, we had faced the HOA and won a small but significant battle. The war might not be over, but I was ready to fight it, one step at a time. Months passed, and while the HOA didn't disappear completely, they certainly backed off. No more demands to turn my cabin into a guest house, no more gifts left on my porch, and most importantly, no more threats. It was as if the protest had drawn an invisible line in the sand, one they weren't willing to cross again. Not openly, anyway. Life at the cabin slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after everything that had happened. The woods were still quiet, the mornings still crisp with dew, but something inside me had shifted. I felt stronger, more grounded. For so long, I'd let fear creep into every corner of my mind, convincing me I was powerless. But standing up to the HOA taught me otherwise. I realized that fighting for what matters doesn't just protect your home. It protects your spirit. Of course, not all traces of tension vanished overnight. Every now and then, I'd hear whispers about new disputes between the HOA and other homeowners. A neighbor might get fined for painting their mailbox the wrong shade of blue, or someone else would complain about being pressured to host an HOA event. When these stories reached me, I made it a point to reach out, offering support however I could. Some people wanted advice, others just needed someone to listen. Whatever they needed, I gave freely, knowing how isolating those battles could feel. One day, a woman named Sarah stopped by my cabin unannounced. She lived deeper in the woods than I did, far enough from the subdivision that she rarely interacted with the HOA. But lately they'd started sniffing around her property too, claiming she needed to clear some trees near the boundary line. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. Her hands trembled as she sipped the tea I'd poured for her. "You're not alone," I told her firmly. "We'll figure this out together." That evening I called Claire, and within days we organized another meeting. This time, it wasn't just about my fight. It was about protecting everyone who felt bullied by the HOA. We created a loose network of neighbors, sharing resources, legal advice, and moral support. If anyone received a letter or a visit from the HOA, they knew they could count on us to help them push back. As the months turned into a year, I noticed subtle changes in the community. People began speaking up more, refusing to bow to unreasonable demands. Fines went unpaid, rules were ignored, and eventually the HOA's iron grip started to loosen. They couldn't control everyone anymore, not when so many of us were united against them. Back at the cabin, life felt sweeter than ever. Max visited more often, bringing friends who marveled at the simplicity of the place. "It's like stepping into another world," one of them said during a summer barbecue. And they were right. My cabin wasn't perfect. It creaked when the wind blew, and the roof leaked occasionally. But it was mine. Every scratch on the walls, every squeaky floorboard, told a story of resilience and triumph. On especially peaceful evenings, I'd sit on the porch and watch the fireflies dance among the trees. The memories of the HOA's harassment lingered faintly, like shadows retreating into the forest, but they no longer haunted me. Instead, they reminded me of how far I'd come, and how much stronger I'd become. One chilly autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled in the breeze, I received a letter in the mail. At first glance, it looked like the ones I'd dreaded before, but when I opened it, I found something unexpected. It was from a local newspaper, thanking me for inspiring a series of articles about property rights and HOA abuses. The writer praised our group's efforts, calling us a model for communities everywhere. I read the article twice, smiling at the quotes from neighbors and allies who had stood beside me. At the bottom, there was even a photo of me holding a sign during the protest, my face determined despite the wind tugging at my hair. Seeing myself like that, a fighter, a leader, filled me with pride. Later that day, I pinned the clipping to the bulletin board in my kitchen, next to Max's drawings and old grocery lists. It wasn't just a reminder of what we'd achieved. It was proof that standing up for yourself can inspire others to do the same. Now, when I walk through the woods or sit by the fireplace with a book, I feel a deep sense of peace. This cabin isn't just a refuge anymore. It's a testament to courage, to standing firm when the odds seem insurmountable. And every time I step inside, I remind myself of one simple truth. Some fights are worth having, because losing isn't always about giving up your home. It's about giving up your voice. And I refuse to be silent.